We're going to our next story about the 3 Israeli hostages that were killed in Gaza. It appears that there were 3 hostages in Gaza. They were shirtless, waving a white flag. In other words, saying, hey, surrender, that kind of thing. And the IDF killed them. They were Israeli hostages. Now, I'm going to show you the picture because I'm just going to make an educated guess here, okay? Because they'll try to say like, well, we didn't know if they were Hamas or not. Ergo, pretty sure dude here on the right with the red hair, pretty sure dude is not Hamas, okay? Just throwing it out there. Just throwing that out there. So these were the victims. IDF says Israeli hostages killed in Gaza were bare-chested and waving a white flag. They're bare-chested. Obviously, you can see they don't have any weapon underneath their shirt or anything like that, right? Let's get into this clip here from Case Study QB where they dive deeper into the story. Because again, this just goes to show you, as I've mentioned before on the show, the IDF will go after anything and anyone. They don't care. They don't care that. So when the advisor to the freaking prime minister, what's his name? Mark Regev, when he makes these comments that like, we're trying to do everything that we can. That is a damn lie. Okay. The government is full of liars. That's a damn lie. You're doing everything that you can. And I told you before, it was never really about the hostages. They don't give a fuck. Let me play.
And we begin with new confirmation of a hostage killed in Gaza. The Israeli Prime Minister's office says 27-year-old Inbar Hyman died while held captive by Hamas. Officials say she was abducted during a festival on October 7th. And news of her death comes as Israel Defense Forces admit to inadvertently killing 3 other Israeli hostages. Officials say the 3 men were waving a white flag when a brigade opened fire on them on Friday. The IDF says the 3 hostages had either managed to escape or were abandoned by their Hamas captors. The office of the Prime Minister now says there are 129 hostages who remain in Gaza. 21 hostages have died. A source tells CNN that the head of Israel's intelligence agency is expected to meet with Qatar's prime minister to discuss getting hostages released. Today, families of the remaining hostages held a rally in Tel Aviv demanding their safe return. CNN's Alex Marquardt was there. Alex, how are people reacting to the reports of the accidental killing of 3 and then the report of the other young lady who has died?
So first of all, in reference to the accident, how is it an accident when they were shirtless and they were waving white flags? You'll see a comment from Norm Finkelstein that I'm going to show later on as well, where Norm Finkelstein actually explains that this is common practice for the IDF to even shoot and kill people that are waving a white flag. They don't care. That's the thing. It was never about the hostages. The IDF has run amok. Let's continue here.
Well, Frederica, this was a rally that would have happened anyway on a Saturday night, but this really gives it more sadness, because of the news today that Inbar Hyman, one of the hostages, is now dead, and the 3 hostages being killed by Israeli forces just yesterday. So there's a lot of sadness, there's a lot of shock because of the event yesterday, and there's a lot of anger. The people we're speaking with here calling on the government to get the hostages to home now. We keep hearing the word achshav in Hebrew, which means now. But we are getting more information from the IDF about exactly what happened yesterday. And the chief of the general staff, so the top general, making clear that it was the Israeli soldiers' responsibility, that they did violate the rules of engagement.
Pause. So once again, we have another example of the IDF or the state of Israel violating rules of engagement. But they've been violating the rules for years. The settlements in the West Bank are illegal. but no one has come in and stopped the state of Israel from continuing to build settlements. How many rules and laws do they have to break before someone holds them accountable? They've never followed the rules. Like that's the point. But so what? So what? You announced this on CNN. They've announced it on MSNBC. They've announced it on all of network television. Okay, great. We know they're not following the rule. Where's the accountability? What's going to be done? And this is because the United States government has basically given the state of Israel a pass. You basically let them do whatever they want. They are seriously like committing genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza, and there's no accountability, no pushback. All we get are speeches from Kamala Harris and Joe Biden that say you must abide by the rules, but they're not. They're clearly not. They can do whatever the fuck they want. And this is a big part of the problem. There's no accountability. Now, let me ask you this question. Those 3 hostages, Israeli hostages that they were so desperate to get back, were killed by the IDF, not by the Palestinian people, not by Hamas, right? Has Hamas killed any of the hostages yet? Do we have that information?
These 3 hostages were killed, and it's just so heartbreaking because they were on the cusp of freedom. They had spent more than 70 days in captivity and were just about potentially to be rescued by the Israeli soldiers when they were shot and killed. These 3 men were seen as threats, according to the IDF. Some of the soldiers engaged, shooting and killing 2 of the hostages immediately. Another one of the hostages fled into a building and started shouting in Hebrew. A brigade commander called for a ceasefire. That didn't happen. The firing continued in the third.
Pause. We're going to go back. Okay. Let's go back a little bit because there's something he said here
about potentially to be rescued by the Israeli soldiers when they were shot and killed. These 3 men were seen as threats.
They were seen as a threat, but they were shirtless and waving a white flag.
According to the IDF, some of the soldiers engaged, shooting and killing 2 of the hostages immediately. Another one of the hostages fled into a building and started shouting in Hebrew. A brigade commander called for a ceasefire.
The brigade commander called for a ceasefire. This is now the third hostage was actually shouting in Hebrew. The brigade commander called for a ceasefire. They killed him anyway. Now I want you to compare this to the police in the United States, because the IDF trains the police in the United States. That's where they get their tactics from. So the IDF tells you that they saw them as a threat. How is that any different from when police officers tell you that they saw the person that they committed police brutality against as a threat? They were resisting. Here are these men waving white flags and shirtless, and you thought they were a threat. Even when the commander told them to cease the fire, they did it anyway. That is intentional. And that is not the IDF trying to prevent civilian casualties. That is murder.
That didn't happen. The firing continued and the 3rd hostage was killed. The bodies were confirmed to be those of the hostages once they were taken back into Israel. There is some speculation that they may have escaped from captivity, as you said, or maybe that as the Hamas militants left their positions, that they simply abandoned these hostages. So the head of the IDF apologizing, saying this is absolutely tragic, but also that this is a highly stressful combat situation in which there have been a lot of terrorists dressed in civilian clothes who have been carrying explosives, and that had made the situation a lot more complicated, Fred.
They were shirtless. They were shirtless.
And then, Alex, I mean, the IDF has launched an investigation, into these deaths. They have admitted that this happened, but how do they win the confidence of family members who are outraged. I know we have not heard directly from the family members of these three hostages who have been killed, but I mean, clearly people are outraged that this could even happen. How does the IDF respond to their concerns now about the safety of the remaining hostages?
It's very difficult, and what the Netanyahu government needs to do in the eyes of so many of the people out here is to show that they are willing to talk and willing to try to get these hostages home.
Listen to the rhetoric that she just used. She said, what about the safety of the remaining hostages? Those three hostages were not killed by Hamas. They were killed by their own people. They were killed by their own.
What this incident yesterday has done is made people so much more afraid for the hostages who remain inside Gaza, their well-being. We know that there are hostages who have been released and their families who have accused the government and the military of not knowing where they were in Gaza, of carrying out strikes near where they were, which resulted in some injuries. I spoke about this with the daughter of one of the hostages who was released 2 weeks ago. We spoke with them just moments ago. Take a listen.
They heard all the bombing, and they were very, very frightened that the bombing will be falling on them, that they will die from the army missiles.
The shelling.
Yeah, and they told us they didn't believe that the army really knew where they are, because they were shooting very, very close, and they heard all the loud noises of that bombing. And I really think that we should do anything to stop the war.
So that part right there is interesting, because she tells you that they didn't really know that basically Hamas was saying that the IDF didn't really know where they were, which proves once again that what Israel is doing, they're just bombing everything and everyone, and that they're not trying to avoid civilian casualties. Norm Finkelstein actually talked about this as well. He said there's shock that Israel killed 3 civilians. As it turned out, Israelis who had been taken hostage carrying white flags. But killing civilians carrying white flags is standard operating procedure of the SS. He calls it the Satanic State. And he listed a report here, a 63-page report that's based on field investigations of 7 incident sites in Gaza. So that piece here, which is from the Human Rights Watch, they said white flag deaths. This was reported back in 2009, killing of Palestinian civilians during Operation Cast Lead. So just FYI, guys, this is a long thing. I'm not going to go into all of this, but this was an issue back in 2009. So again, these things are not new. Now, what's really interesting is where Biden stands in all of this. And I just want to show you something that's been reported recently by The Nation, which honestly contradicts what Biden says when he's like, we have to worry about, the children and all that kind of stuff in Gaza. That's actually not true in how he feels. The Nation reported Biden's close alliance with Israel has been a lodestar of his work in foreign policy. During Israel's 1982 war with Lebanon, he went so far as to claim that women and children would be legitimate targets in Israel's campaign for greater security. So you see this? He already knew, and that's The Nation. Biden's Israel policies are still on the wrong track. And I'll just jump to this piece here. Let me jump ahead here. It says Biden went on to call Netanyahu for Israel's indiscriminate bombing campaign in Gaza and warned that it was costing the Jewish state critical worldwide support in the wake of the horrific October 7th terror campaign that Hamas launched against Israeli civilians. These were welcome, if far too incremental, developments for a Biden White House that's repeatedly stressed that it is not seeking to impose red lines of any sort on Israel's campaign of mass death among Palestinian civilian populations, even as it's done precious little to eradicate or displace Hamas operations. So here they are calling out Joe Biden, and they're basically telling you, like, if you read this whole article, if you pay attention to Joe Biden's track record in the past, he did not have an issue with this. So again, Biden's Israel policies are still on the wrong track. Now, that is the nation. And they bring up the issue with the 1982 war with Lebanon. And something I want to remind you of as well. You have to remember that Ronald Reagan, during the time when Israel bombed Lebanon, Ronald Reagan called for a ceasefire. When Ronald Reagan called for a ceasefire at that point in time, that was not a popular decision. It isn't the way it is now, where the majority of Democrats, even some Republicans, are saying we need a ceasefire. That was not the case during that time. So Ronald Reagan called for that ceasefire when it was unpopular to do so. And obviously he took more heat. We are now living in a time where it is popular to do so. The majority of Democrats want you to call for a ceasefire, and Joe Biden is refusing to do it. So that shows you that even when it came to this particular issue, Ronald Reagan was to the left of Joe Biden when it came to Israel bombing other countries. Now, the United Kingdom and Germany have now decided to call for a ceasefire. And I just think it's really interesting because before they didn't want to call for a ceasefire, but now that 3 Israeli hostages were killed by the IDF, now Germany and the UK are willing to call for a ceasefire. You guys see how this is going? Morning Joe talked about this. Let's go ahead and get into it.
This hour, the United Kingdom and Germany are now joining the growing calls for a ceasefire as Israeli troops continue to ramp up their attacks across Gaza. Israel has come under increased scrutiny over protecting civilian lives after soldiers mistakenly shot and killed 3 hostages on Friday. NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel has the very latest.
The 3 Israeli hostages in Gaza made white flags to warn their own army not to shoot, smearing SOS in old food and writing in Hebrew, "Help 3 hostages." The Israeli military released the images overnight, saying the hostages were nonetheless mistakenly shot by Israeli troops. Israel's chief of staff told soldiers the friendly fire could have been avoided, saying the hostages took off their shirts so that no one would think they have an explosive device and held a white cloth on a pole to identify themselves. They came speaking Hebrew, calling for help, he said, telling the troops never to shoot anyone with their hands up. The families of hostages still in Gaza are outraged.
You guys hear that? Don't shoot anyone with their hands up. Connect that to police in the United States shooting people that have their hands up.
Calling daily for Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to resume negotiations with Hamas and bring their loved ones home.
I am angry that the government let this situation get so far. I am angry at the world that is not supporting a deal right now, because this is the only way to bring them back home. And I am angry right now, I'm angry at all.
Opinion polls suggest Israelis remain united in their support for the war in Gaza to destroy Hamas, but not in Prime Minister Netanyahu's leadership. Under U.S. pressure, this weekend, Israel opened a second crossing into Gaza for humanitarian supplies, but it's still far too little. 12-year-old Rosan Al-Habash, displaced from her home in northern Gaza, says she waits in line for hours to get food for her family. Every day I wake up at 8 and leave for the food bank. Sometimes we spend the day without eating anything, she says. Human Rights Watch this morning accused Israel of using starvation as a war crime.
That's right, because for those that may not die due to actual bombing, they may die because of starvation.
Yesterday, with international pressure growing, the Israeli military continued to make its case for the offensive, releasing video of what it calls the largest tunnel it's found underneath the Gaza Strip, and showing a man the military identified as the brother of a top Hamas leader driving through it. NBC News has not been able to verify the footage.
And Richard joined.
They weren't able to verify the footage, but they thought they could show it anyway. Okay.
Joins us now live from Jerusalem. Richard, how is Israel responding to the pressure from the families of the hostages?
Well, officially, the Israeli government has issued many statements of condolences, many statements of regret. The chief of the army has said that this was unavoidable. Prime Minister Netanyahu said he bows his head in respect and mourns with the country. They've said officially that they will continue to put pressure militarily on Hamas and continue the war. But what we are seeing now is also, and the Israeli government isn't linking the two, is we are seeing a resumption of ceasefire talks, and those ceasefire talks are underway now. NBC News can confirm with the director of the CIA, the director of the Mossad, and senior Qatari officials. So the talks are back, trying to secure some sort of hostage deal, but the parameters are not totally clear. I'm told by people directly involved in these conversations that so far the Israelis only want to talk about tactical issues. They only want to talk about the hostages, how many hostages could be freed, under what terms, how many Palestinian prisoners might be freed, and that Hamas and the negotiators themselves want to talk more strategically about a longer-term solution, how to get out of this crisis. And Hamas has made it clear what its term is. It wants, if there is to be another ceasefire, it wants it to be a permanent ceasefire, not just another week and then Israel resumes again. So still very difficult negotiations ahead, but they are happening now.
Well, I've always said from day one, if they really cared that much about the hostages, they would have called for a ceasefire. Now, this isn't the end of this, because it is actually now you have the Houthis in the Red Sea. They have actually intercepted some of the weapons that the U.S. government is trying to send to Israel, because Yemen said, not up in here. Yemen said nobody else is going to protect or look out for the Arab countries. We're going to look out for one of the Arab countries, and we're going to tell you, not up in here. You are not going to continue to do this to the Palestinian people. Nico had some things to say about that. And it's also, I want to play that, but also I want to tell you that the U.S. government was actually also trying to pressure Saudi Arabia to join them with this alliance and to try to fight against the Houthi rebels in the Red Sea. Saudi Arabia said, hell to the no. Saudi Arabia said, hell to the no, no. We're not getting in your mess anymore. I told you Saudi Arabia was that fair weather friend. They walked away from the United States. They got other friends, and they said, you guys on that crazy shit, I'm going to be hanging out with China and Russia, and you guys on your own now. So Nico talked about this. I thought this was really interesting. Nico's been doing these clips from Hotspot, Nico and my comrade Nick from RBN, where they do like these little short clips and they break it down. Yemen, U.S. to announce expanded protection force for Red Sea shipping.
So the United States has announced expanded protection for Red Sea shipping. And the reason why is pretty simple. Yemen has been giving Israeli shipments all of the work they could ask for. Already, 5 big shipping companies have now stopped their ships from using the Red Sea in wake of attacks mounted by the Houthis in protest of Israel's genocide in Gaza. Now, I want to be clear about that, because this article tries to say that it's because they're protesting the elimination of Hamas. That's not it. They're protesting genocide, so I just want to be clear. Even BP had to suspend shipping. Despite knowing that the United States has their back, they were like, y'all might have our back, but this ain't about to be the day that we figure out whether or not the Houthis are liars. So to combat the Houthis holding down the Red Sea in protest of the genocide that is happening in Gaza, allegedly the United States plans on putting a coalition together that includes Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, UAE, of course the US, France, and Great Britain. Now, of course, the United States and Israel, of course, and France and Britain, we kind of expect. But what in the Uncle Tom is going on with Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE? What makes this even more interesting is that we know that Saudi Arabia and Yemen have had a bit of a tumultuous past, to say the least, considering Saudi Arabia was funding a genocide in Yemen. But they were actually on the verge of a peace deal that the United States is now pressuring Saudi Arabia to break in order to form this coalition.
This is a piece that I think the United States government wasn't prepared for. I think they thought that because, the U.S. government, we were the ones giving weapons to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia used those weapons on people in Yemen. Yemen is pretty much, it's sad. Like if you see the pictures of the country, what it looks like now, it's really sad. It's pretty much been demolished for the most part. But I think the U.S. government thought that we helped you, we gave you weapons to fight against Yemen. So now you're going to return the favor for us. And Saudi Arabia is like, no, I'm good, bro. Saudi Arabia is like, yeah, we just hung out with Vladimir Putin. We're actually all good. You guys do what you need to do, but we're all right, bro.
And Yemen has made it clear that if Saudi Arabia and the UAE join this coalition, of course, that would violate the peace deal, and they're just going to bomb the shit out of their oil and gas field. I think what makes this a little bit more frustrating is the fact that you see the average person from Saudi Arabia and the average person from the UAE and the average Arab from even Egypt all supporting the Palestinian cause and calling out Israel's genocide there. And yet the leadership of these countries are selling out their people, selling out their culture, and selling out their brothers and sisters and cousins in Palestine on behalf of the United States and a NATO power that would betray them the moment it's convenient. So let's hope that this coalition never comes into fruition and that Saudi Arabia and the UAE will continue this peace deal with Yemen, because that's definitely better than allowing shipments to continue to get through to Israel that would just let them have supplies that they'll continue to use in the genocide of Gaza. I mean, I feel like a peace deal is probably better for everybody than the latter.
Yeah. But it's the fact that, again, like not so much the leaders of those countries, but it took the Houthis. So you can see here, I'm not going to play the video because it's straight up mad propaganda. But it says breaking, the U.S. military has announced a 10-nation coalition against Yemeni Houthis in the Red Sea. Only one Arab country, Bahrain, is part of the coalition. Saudi Arabia and the UAE rejected the U.S. proposal to join. Dun, dun, dun. Saudi Arabia said, not this time, bruh. You guys are on some of that psycho stuff, so we're done with that. Now, there's also this issue about financial support, because this is a piece that's often left out. As much as Netanyahu and other government officials are criticizing Hamas, you have to also remember that Israel actually funded Hamas. Case study QB reminded me of this with this clip here. We have to bring it back in. Guess where the money came from?
Richard, I want to ask you about this latest update about Israeli officials learning how Hamas was financing its operations back in 2018 and apparently did nothing about it. This is according to the New York Times, which reviewed documents that were pilfered from the computer of a senior Hamas official. The ledgers listed assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars, including skyscrapers in the UAE and a real estate firm listed on the Turkish stock exchange. The Times writes this was a potential roadmap for choking off Hamas's money and thwarting its plans. The documents were shared with Washington, but the Times reports none of the companies faced sanctions from the U.S. or Israel for years. They were also never publicly called out or pressured by Turkey to shut down. Instead, officials were focused on putting financial pressure on Iran. Now, according to the Times, tens of millions of dollars flowed from the companies to Hamas at the exact moment that it was buying new weapons. Israeli and American officials now admit that money laid the groundwork for the October 7th attacks.
And Richard.
So you see what they're trying to do, right? They're basically, this is Israel trying to blame other countries for Hamas being able to get funding in the first place. But you have to remember, again, especially in the beginning, Israel gave money to Hamas. They funded them. But now they're trying to put the blame on the other countries.
On top of that, we, of course, got the report that Doha, just a month before the attacks, asked Netanyahu's government, do you want us to continue funding Hamas's government? And Netanyahu's people said yes. What's the reaction in Israel?
See, they have to admit these things now on mainstream media because so much information has come out from independent sources, and especially the students. I told you guys, the younger people, they're very resourceful, so they've been able to find this extra information. So of course now they have to admit it on Morning Joe that Israel knew. They knew.
So if the question is, how is it that Hamas got so rich under the watch of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu? The answer that many Israelis have and have had for a long time is that having Hamas in power in Gaza benefited Prime Minister Netanyahu because he had an obvious enemy. He had an extremist in power on the Palestinian side in Gaza, at least, who we did not have to negotiate with. So
because it benefited Netanyahu. And by benefiting Netanyahu, it benefited the state of Israel. He wanted them to be there. Does everybody understand that? He wanted them to be in power.
Therefore, it was very easy. You close off Gaza, you leave Hamas in power, and then you can say to the world that there is no other solution, that there is no partner to deal with, as opposed to having a more moderate, reasonable government that you want to talk to on the Palestinian side. Because if you talk to a moderate, reasonable government on the Palestinian side, then you have to cut a deal. You have to have a two-state solution. And this government has made it clear it does not want to have a two-state solution. And if that's your basic arguing point, you don't want a two-state solution, then it helps you if you have someone else on the other side who doesn't want a two-state solution either.
Ding, 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 ding. I'm surprised they allowed him to say this on MSNBC. Bingo. Exactly. He wanted them to be in power so that he could say that there was a threat and that he would not have to abide to a two-state solution, and that they are always the common enemy. He wanted them to be there. Just like the New York Times said that they knew over a year ago that they were planning this attack. Why would you not do anything? Maybe because they wanted it to happen. So they have a reason to wipe out the Palestinian population in Gaza. Now, another thing that's been happening here, connecting this to this as well, if you have not seen this, there was actually a Harvard professor's wife who harassed a Harvard student who was walking down the street wearing a keffiyeh, and basically said she was wearing a terrorist scarf. This woman used to work for the Obama administration. This is a liberal who are making these comments. So this goes back to another example I want to show you, where you have these white bougie liberals, particularly in these progressive areas, like we have some here in Massachusetts, that they pretend like they're tolerant and they're accepting of everybody, but they have their bias and their racism too. And this is another thing. Again, you don't see as much mainstream media talking about this because it's happening to someone on the other side. But if it were the other way around, and if it was someone saying this to a Jewish student walking down the street, it would be blasted all over the media everywhere. They would talk about it nonstop. They would be in Congress trying to set some type of legislation in place for people walking down the street. Kid you not. But because it's not, she issues just an apology, and her apology is whack. Katie Halper focused on her apology. Listen to this.
A professor at Harvard's Kennedy School and a former Obama advisor. And she's speaking to a Harvard graduate student wearing a keffiyeh who was walking down the street. Let's hear what Eve Gerber had to say.
Hi, Kamra. Thank you for walking through neighborhoods and making families feel unsafe with your terrorist scarf.
Palestinians felt pretty unsafe when Israelis occupied their country, you know.
So this woman that you see here, hold up, let me go back. You see her? You see this passive aggressive, watch this.
With your terrorist scarf.
That, you see that? That's the same type of white liberal racism that you tend to see here in the Northeast. That's not a Trumper. That's not a Republican. That's a liberal. A Harvard professor's wife. I told you they're racist too. This is what I've been trying to tell people. Do you know how thrilled I was to see this video? Don't like what happened to the student, but I was thrilled to see this because I said I've been trying to tell people this for the longest time. They're racist here too. The liberals, the Obama friends, the people who worked for the Obama administration. These people are bougie, racist liberals. They're not yelling and telling you to get out their country. They don't have on a t-shirt that says go back to where you came from. They may not be calling you the N-word. No, they do bougie, passive aggressive racism. They'll follow you down the street to make you feel a little bit uncomfortable so you don't feel like you can walk through that neighborhood anymore. Now, she apologized.
Palestinians felt pretty unsafe when Israelis occupied their country, you know.
I'm glad you're so proud of the slaughtering of civilians.
I'm not.
But don't worry, guys, because Eve has apologized. She took to Twitter to say, on 10/14, after I overheard chants I found disturbing at a rally near my house, I spoke with a person on my block who I thought had come from that event. When the political argument escalated, I used indefensible words. I was wrong to confront someone based on their dress and to use divisive, accusatory language. In the 2 months since this video, I've tried to learn more and take reparative action. I will continue to do so. Hate and inhumanity in any form are abhorrent to me. I deeply regret what I said and did. But what has Eve learned and what reparative action has she taken? Because this non-apology strikes me as victim blaming and continuing to play the victim. See, she's saying that she only said those things because she thought the woman she yelled at had come from the rally. She says, after I overheard chants I found disturbing at a rally near my home, I spoke with a woman on my block who I thought had come from that event. So Eve is still defending her logic. Eve's mistake was assuming the woman had come from that event and assuming that she had participated in the chants Eve finds disturbing.
This is another thing that they'll do. The racist white liberals. This is another thing that they'll do. Oh, I didn't know. I thought she was coming from the rally. Even if she was coming from the rally, that does not give you the right to do what you did to her or say what you did to her. The point being, she's still racist. Period.
Chances are the chants were something like, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, or Intifada. But the problem is that neither of those chants is genocidal or calls for violence against Jews. But Eve is weaponizing victimhood to stigmatize what are actually calls for equal rights for Palestinians. So Eve has a lot more learning and reparative work to do.
Yes, she does. And here's another thing. Have you noticed where are all the people that were crying and saying that the Jewish students need to be protected and feel safe on campus? Where are all those voices in reference to what happened to this young woman walking down the street? Where are those voices? She's a student. Where are the voices about that woman being harassed, walking down the street, minding her own business? Oh, you don't hear those voices now. You know why? Because she's not Jewish. She's not Israeli. So they don't care. It was never really about that. It is about backing supremacy. It is about degrading the Palestinian people. And why would they choose to back supremacy? Because of all the organizations and the lobbyists that are connected to the Zionist movement and the people who are involved. It was never really about that. But at the end of the day, you just saw 3 Israeli hostages were killed by the IDF. They were killed by their own people. Where's the outcry, Bill Ackman? Oh, Michael Rappaport, you got to rant every other 5 minutes on Twitter. Blah, 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 blah. Every time I turn on Twitter, I see this guy got his mouth open, whining like a little bitch. Every time. You going to say anything about that, Michael? Barry Weiss. So terrified, so afraid. We got to protect people and save people. Where's your comment about that, Barry? Silence. Let's go to some of the comments here in the chat. Killier Gorgie says the IDF are following the Henry Kissinger protocol to kill anything that moves. That policy did get him a Nobel Peace Prize in 1971. Thank you, Gonzo. The UK called for the ceasefire 45 minutes after BP said their freighters will not go through the Red Sea, not the death of hostages. Interesting. Thank you, Nelson. Thank you, Sabby, for always bringing us great content to open our minds. You are welcome.